Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm your host. I'm happy to be here. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about the 5 most important concepts for a better life. Now, that's a pretty catchy title. 5 important concepts for a better life. Another way of thinking about it are 5 ways in which, 5 ideas, 5 theories that we can hold in our minds that may be supportive for us as we endeavor on this journey, on this process of self-improvement or learning more about ourselves or learning how to be more of who we are. I am so thrilled to be here. This is a one-woman job here. I do my podcast that is a labor of love to bring ideas to life out into the world that I hope is supportive and helpful. I don't get paid for my podcast. This is really my side, a side hobby of the work that I do as a psychotherapist, as a supervisor. I consult. I have a mentorship for coaches. But anyway, all that to say is that this is quite the labor of love. I love doing it. And if you're listening, thank you for being here. I'm endlessly appreciative of you and your time and attention. I know that it's very hard to grab people's attention, especially for the long content, right? For these kind of hour-long time together. But this is the best way that I can deliver the information that I want to deliver. So thanks for being here. One other thing that I want to mention before I get into this podcast, I do have current availability right now in my caseload for individuals who are looking for support, whether you are looking for support around the worthiness wound, around these feelings of inadequacy, if you're wanting support around relational difficulties, if you're wanting support around knowing yourself better, working through trauma, or just like general betterment, anxiety, depression, working together may be a good fit for you. You can go to my website, thaissky.com/therapy to learn more about how I work. And I'm also happy to answer any questions that you may have. You can email me at info@thaissky.com. And I also do couples work, and I really love the couples work that I do. So if you're looking for support in your relationship, couples work may be a good fit for you. Again, all of that is available on my website. Okay, so let's get into this topic of the 5 most important concepts for a better life. Now, most important, okay, I don't know. Maybe there are other more important concepts for you in your life, but these are like 5 of the most important for me right now. 5 important ideas for how to improve your quality of life intrapsychically, like internally. I'm not talking about externally. I know that we are living in precarious times and there are so many important resources and ways in which we can think about how to navigate the complexities of our culture, how to navigate our capitalistic system. If you're in the United States, like there's so many things that we can think about in terms of grappling with the things on the outside. But my expertise as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist is understanding the internal world and understanding the ways our internal world impacts our lives. And so these concepts are things that I believe are important to know as we're navigating our own hearts and minds so that we can foster the types of relationships we want, both with ourselves and those around us. Okay, so the first concept is the more we know ourselves, the better. And I think that this may be understood on some level, like maybe we can kind of intellectually understand that the more we know ourselves, the better. But I think there are all sorts of ways in which we resist this understanding because knowing ourselves can actually be quite frightening. I see sometimes on TikTok this archetype of a person who is so self-aware and they go to therapy and they are so aware of themselves that the therapist then is like, I don't know how to help you. You already know your problems. That's not what I'm talking about here. That type of self-awareness or that form of intellectualization where we know ourselves is actually a defense. It's a way that we're protecting ourselves from experiencing something deeper within ourselves. When we are so in the know, we are so self-aware, we know our problems. I want us to pause and wonder if the knowing is actually a defense against the feeling, the experience of being in ourselves. And if a therapist says to you, like, wow, you just know so much about yourself, I don't know how I can help you, that speaks more to the therapist's qualifications than it does to you being so evolved that you don't need support and help, right? But I think that that's a kind of common misunderstanding when I'm talking about knowing ourselves, that we then think that that means that we have to develop this type of intellectualization. But intellectualization is a defense. And understanding our defenses is partly what I mean when I'm saying the more we know ourselves, the better. The richer our relationships are, the more we know ourselves, the more choice we have, the more freedom we have. When we know more of ourselves, we can start to understand the patterns that are playing out in our lives in like a deeper way. Again, not just an intellectual exercise, but actually a way in which we're re-experiencing something really painful, really traumatic. And maybe now we have an opportunity to relate to it or face it in a different way. So when I'm saying the more we know ourselves, I'm inviting a curiosity towards our mind. And that can actually be very frightening for some of us because we have all sorts of ways in which we try to not know ourselves. And we call that a defense. So the first kind of part of this idea of the more we know ourselves, the better, that I want to break down is that, the creator or the originator of this idea of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, Sigmund Freud, part of what made his ideas so revolutionary is that he proposed an idea about the mind that says that we actually don't know so much of ourselves, that there is much of ourselves that we just don't know. And he called it the unconscious. And so now it's become pervasive in pop culture, the subconscious or the unconscious. Well, subconscious is a CBT term, but of the unconscious. And I think sometimes we use it so popularly, so often that we've lost meaning or sight of what this means. The unconscious is not this like place in our minds that we just have to kind of get in touch with, and then it becomes conscious and it no longer exists. The unconscious is simply a name for an experience of not fully knowing our hearts and minds. And that we are often mired with conflicting thoughts and feelings that can feel so terrifying to be aware of that we find ways to keep it away from our awareness. The unconscious is alive within us at every moment in time. For example, as I'm here recording you, I may not be aware of until I explore later or I think about it later, the ways in which I may be, for example, very nervous, right? So I'm not feeling nervous now, but maybe when I reflect later and I wonder, oh, why did I say that? Or why did I move my hands so much? Or why did I speak in this way? Why did I say so much or like? What the opportunity there is for me to wonder what may be going on unconsciously that is pulling me towards certain behaviors or certain patterns of speech. Maybe I was actually quite nervous. And so even though I'm not aware of my nervousness, it doesn't mean that maybe I'm not that way. Now, that's a pretty, shallow example. But the truth is that this is happening to us all the time. There are things that we are aware of, and there are things that we are not aware of. And it is happening in our minds all of the time. And so the point of the unconscious isn't to conquer it, isn't to, if I'm healed or if I know myself fully, it means I don't have an unconscious life. And that's where the fantasy of I know myself so well, I don't need therapy or therapy can't help me. I'm so self-aware that nobody can help me. The misunderstanding there is the fantasy that we can be so aware of ourselves, that we can totally know ourselves. The unconscious will always be occurring because there are ways in which we place our energy in certain areas and neglect others. One metaphor that we can think about this is turning on the light in the room. The brighter the light, the darker the shadows, right? So the more light we bring in, the more awareness that we bring in, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a shadow or that there isn't an unconscious. It is just to say that the unconscious is always there. There are always shadows. There are always things that we just don't know of ourselves. It's not meant to be this terrifying proposition. It's meant to help us have a little bit more compassion for why we may be re-experiencing or replaying certain patterns in our lives unknowingly, like unbeknownst to us. Yes? So the idea of the unconscious isn't meant to be now this idea that the perfectionism in us latches onto to promote this way of like having to know ourselves so fully so that we have no unconscious. It's more that this is a phenomenon that happens in our minds. There are things that we know about ourselves and there are things that we don't know about ourselves. And part of what psychoanalytic psychotherapy or therapy in general or other types of kind of self-work ideas, part of what the opportunity is to expand what we know of ourselves so that we are not surprised by certain unconscious processes. If I know more of myself, then I can be more aware of when maybe there is something else going on rather than being so surprised by my reaction or so surprised that I'm having such a big feeling about something. I can be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense that I'm having a big feeling about it because on some level I'm experiencing it this way. So, okay, let me back up. The unconscious, right? The point I'm trying to make is it refers to the part of the mind that lies outside of our awareness and yet has profound influence on our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, and our relationships. It contains, the unconscious contains memories, desires, fears, and emotional experiences that are way too overwhelming, painful, or contradictory for us to process consciously. So these kind of unconscious elements can manifest in subtle ways. It can come out in dreams, and dreams can be such a cool place for us to understand and explore our unconscious mind. Freud really liked the idea of slips of tongue, right? Freudian slips, the ways in which something from our unconscious is slipping out. But more commonly, it comes out as automatic reactions and patterns in relationships. So without understanding why, we may have a really strong emotional response that seems out of proportion to the current moment. Somebody says something very benignly and we interpret it to mean something really, really painful. It may be in those moments, what may be happening is we are having an unconscious process. It's touching something out of our awareness that is now coming forth through a lot of emotion. And so, the more that we can understand our hidden motivations and conflicts that are kind of shaping our inner lives, we gain greater insight, we gain greater emotional freedom and the ability to make more intentional choices. So the more that we can get curious about the fact that there are things that we don't know about ourselves, and the more that we can then allow ourselves through either support or through journaling or through meditation, through exploration of dream work, through creative writing, there's all sorts of ways that we can start to expand and get in touch with our unconscious. We start to maybe develop more freedom in our lives. So one of the ways in which we protect ourselves from our unconscious, from these really scary memories or motivations, fears, is through something called defense mechanisms. Now, while Freud was the one who originated the idea of the unconscious, and he's the one that kind of came up with this idea of defenses, his daughter, Anna Freud, really took his ideas and really started to kind of study it more in depth, what are defense mechanisms and how exactly do they work? And again, I think defenses is a very common idea. It's very popular in pop culture to say you're defensive or that's a defense mechanism. I think sometimes we really miss on what is the core idea of defenses. So a defense mechanism, it's an unconscious process. The minute you are aware that it's a defense, it changes the flavor of it. It changes the power of it. So generally, a part of what makes a defense is that it is unconscious. So it's an unconscious strategy. We really believe that we are so self-aware. What we may not understand is that self-awareness is a defense. So we think this is the truth. We're not aware of how this sense of self-awareness is actually a defense against, a protection against anxiety, emotional discomfort, or threats to our sense of self. So these defense mechanisms help us manage feelings or thoughts that might be painful, overwhelming, difficult to confront directly. And of course, it's important that we acknowledge that defense mechanisms are adaptive. They were created out of a context, out of relating and being related to in a way that helped, that was painful or that stirred things up. And so we developed defenses to help us cope in the short term. But the problem with defenses is not that they exist. We need protection against anxiety. We can't always be in touch with anxiety, right? Like if we were always in touch with how out of control we are and how life can come at us fast and we can die at any moment. If we were always in touch with that, I think we would have a really hard time surviving. We would have a hard time living. We can't always be in touch with our death, right? It's important to get in touch with it. It's important to confront it, to think about it, to talk about it. But if we're getting to the point, right, where we're always aware of it, we may find ourselves quite paralyzed. Anyway, so we have to find ways to defend against it. That we have to find ways to protect ourselves from always being in touch with our anxieties. That is totally fine. The problem is when our defenses start to get very rigid. So it's not really, the problem isn't really the existence of defenses. It's over-reliance on defenses or over-reliance on a certain set of defenses. The more flexible we can be with what defenses we elicit or we use, the kind of healthier the psyche. And so it's important to know, okay, so kind of back to the theme here, a really important concept for living a better life is that the more we know ourselves, the better. And in that understanding comes first an acknowledgement that we can't know everything about ourselves, that there is an unconscious way in which there are unconscious processes. There are things that will always be on some level out of our awareness. And that is not just, that is a function, that is a product of the way in which our mind works. It's not a function or it's not an illustration of your being brokenness or you not being perfect enough. We all have an unconscious. And the ways in which we protect ourselves from our unconscious are called defenses. And the more that we understand our own defenses, the more that we understand what we're so frightened of in our unconscious, the more we can know ourselves, the more space we can have for all of these processes to happen inside of ourselves without the shame or the sense of there's something broken within us for experiencing, for example, a defense. So there are a number of defenses, and some of them are more popular and well-known than others. Like we have denial. That's a really popular one, like popular in that we know it well, like you're in denial, right? And we can see how painful it is when people are in denial. We can see that they may be in denial because they're really scared of confronting something in themselves, right? There's projection, where we imagine that the other person is feeling something that may actually be ours. And it's, we're putting it onto them. We're saying you're angry when really we're angry because we're having a hard time tolerating our own anger. There's rationalization where we are able to explain our uncomfortable feelings with really logical reasons. Of course, there's intellectualization where we intellectualize, we move into a knowing space to avoid the discomfort of the not knowing. There's like sublimation where we channel really traumatic or painful feelings into socially acceptable productive activities, like doctors who experience something really traumatic as a child, something really bad, like a car accident. And so now they want to be doctors and they want to help people in a way that maybe they weren't helped. That would be a sign. That would be a sublimation. Anyway, we're thinking, what's wrong with that? Like, what's wrong with something? And that question, again, tells us that maybe you are understanding defenses as a sign that there's something wrong. And there isn't anything wrong with defenses. It's a part of being human. Exploring them in therapy, though, can provide insight into how we cope with challenges, right? And like what the patterns are that might shape our relationships and our self-perception. It's just important to know these things. Now, one defense mechanism that I just don't see talked about a lot that I think can actually be a really incredible way that we can gain some understanding of our relationships and our emotional life is called projective identification. So we can understand that projection is, I'm feeling uncomfortable with my anger. I'm putting it onto you. Now, the key part of projection, right, the way that it's a defense is that we cannot seem to recognize that it's in us. So we may be like, what do you mean? I'm not angry. They are angry. That's how we know that there may be a defense at play. Because if I were to say to you, I think you're angry, I don't think they're angry, your initial reaction is to be like, I'm not angry. That's a great indicator that there's a defense. Because what are we saying? The defenses are unconscious. We're not even aware of our own anger. Now, projection in and of itself is a really complicated defense because it can be so easy to get disoriented and feel gaslit. What do you mean? I'm not angry. They are angry, right? And we can feel very confused about what is real. And if we feel really adamant that they are angry and now we have to protect ourselves from their anger, it's going to be really, really hard for us to slow down and examine how actually maybe we may be angry. They may even say to us, I'm not angry. And you may be like, what are you talking about? Your tone and the way you said it clearly shows that you're angry. Now things are getting very confusing. Who is angry here? You feel clear that you're not angry and you feel clear that they're angry. They're saying to you, I'm not angry, you're angry. And it can start to feel like that Spider-Man meme where we're all pointing at each other. And we can start to really get very disoriented about what's real, who's really angry. And it can feel, if we're very rigid, if we feel like we're being now gaslit, like this is what's reality and you're making me question reality, we can then find ourselves getting even more and more defensive and more upset. So one, we have to be careful with these words. Relating to other people by saying that's a projection or, it can actually be quite hurtful. We don't want to be relating to people like their problems and we have to fix them and we have to tell them what they're doing. If somebody says you're angry, there's always a way in which maybe they're true. They're picking up on something. And maybe they're not, and maybe it's not true. But can there be space for an exploration of it? Or is it a sign that one person is right and one person is wrong? And when we start falling into the rabbit hole of who's right and who's wrong, things can get very, very black and white very quickly. But projection in and of itself can be a really complicated defense. And we want to be really careful of how we use it, how we understand it, how we think about it in terms of other people and ourselves. But there's another concept that adds to a complexity to this, but I do think it's really important. And it's this idea of projective identification. So projective identification is almost, it's a relational defense where we are feeling someone's projection. Someone is projecting something onto us, but then we identify with that projection. This happens, as a therapist. It's a language that therapists, especially psychoanalytic psychotherapists, are really trained to understand and to listen for. Because when I'm sitting in front of person A and I did not get a lot of sleep last night, for example, okay, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I have a patient, let's say 8 a.m. And I feel wide awake. I feel good. I feel like, woo, like I'm in work mode. This feels good. I'm alive. There's a lot going on in the session. And then the session ends. And then my 9 o'clock shows up. And my 9 o'clock has a way in which I'm now in the session feeling tremendously sleepy and feeling really hard to be engaged in and really hard to stay connected with the session. I may now experience that emotion as me. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so it makes sense now. My coffee is run out. Now I'm feeling sleepy. I'm feeling tired. That makes sense. This is probably me. But then I have a 10 a.m. And in my 10 a.m., I feel back to being really awake and energized. And I feel really connected. And I feel like there's a lot going on. Now things start to get interesting. What changed between my 9 and my 10? Is the feeling of sleepiness as it partially lies in me, but also maybe coming from my client. It's a feeling that they are having a hard time tolerating, and so they project it onto me. And now I'm identifying with that feeling. The power of understanding projective identification is we start to see that there is a way in which communication is taking place between two people that is not just verbal. There are unconscious ways in which we are communicating with each other that, again, is not even in our awareness. And it often happens in the language of emotions. And the cool thing about projective identification is that it's a way that we start to open up the possibility that there's something being communicated from the other person that is not really mine. And if I'm identifying with it, I'm missing on the opportunity of seeing it as something that's happening relationally. So projection in and of itself is a complicated idea, but now we're adding another complicated idea. We're adding a complex system of a reciprocal form of communication where an individual is unconsciously attributing their own internal feelings to somebody else. So that's the projection. But then the person receiving that projection may begin to feel or behave in ways that align with what is projected onto them, or they are identifying, they are experiencing it as something of themselves. So let's go back to the example of the anger. So person A feels deeply angry, can't acknowledge it. It's unconscious, but projects that anger onto person B and says, "You're angry." And now they may not even be saying it. They may just subtly provoke them. They may just snap at them. Right now, person B may start feeling and expressing anger, which seemingly validates person A's original unconscious belief that person B is angry. But this anger that person B is feeling isn't really theirs. It's what they're picking up and identifying with from person A. It can get so complicated. And I can appreciate and understand why we may be reluctant to understand projective identification, because it adds such a complexity to our already wrought with complicated feelings in our interpersonal dynamics. But what can be cool about projective identification is that we can start to question and create some space inside of ourselves to wonder, is what we're feeling really ours? Or are we picking up something that somebody else is having a hard time holding? Yeah. So projective identification can provide valuable insight into unconscious dynamics of relationships. It can help us understand, how to become more aware of our own emotional states, how we can start to own more of our feelings so we no longer need to use projection or projective identification as a form of communication, right? And it can help us develop a healthier way relating to others. But again, to be clear, projective identification is not bad. It is a sign of our interrelatedness. It is a sign of how often emotional communication is happening without our awareness. And when we can start to get curious about what may be here, and we start to create space for us to feel into our feelings in a different way, we can actually start to foster a deeper type of intimacy with other people. So, important concepts for a better life. The more we know ourselves, the better. But there are all sorts of ways that we can't ever fully know ourselves. However, the ways in which we are defending against what we don't know could actually be preventing us from feeling more free. We have inner conflicts. We have ways in which we both want and don't want. We have ways in which we're trying to protect our sense of self, preserve our goodness by trying to defend against more aggressive tendencies, anger, frustration. If we've been taught that anger, for example, is not accepted and won't be tolerated, we may now try to never feel angry. Does that make the anger go away? No, the anger is still there, but now it's driven unconscious, where it now has more opportunities to wreak havoc in our lives. We may, because we don't know how to hold anger, when anger does come up, it's very destructive, right? So the more that we can learn about ourselves, the more that we can expand our emotional capacities, bear more of our emotional life. It's not that we have less unconscious. We will always have an unconscious, but that the more space we can then create between the action and the reaction. And that takes me to important concept number 2. We know this Viktor Frankl quote, right? That between the stimulus and the response, there is space. And in that space, we can choose something different. I'm butchering the quote, but we know what I mean, right? So in the quote, we're saying that there's an action, there's something happens, something out there is happening. And then there's the reaction, how we respond to it, what we do, how we react. And between action and reaction, there's something else that happens, and the process is often unconscious and it's often very fast, and it's interpretation. So there's an action, there is a stimulus, there is something happening, and then there's an interpretation. We make meaning of what is happening. And often the meaning making is happening very fast. It's almost always like not even we're aware that we're interpreting it. And so then we react thinking that we're reacting from what is happening, but really we're reacting from what we think is happening. That doesn't mean that what we think is happening isn't accurate. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's accurate to a degree. Sometimes, for example, what we're reacting to is a small sliver of the pie. It is still true. It is still a sliver. It is still existing. But maybe if we add more context and nuance, we would see that our reaction is disproportionate to the total degree of the pie. And so it's not about that's not what's happening. It may be that you're picking up on something, but it may not be the totality of what's happening. But if we're reacting to this small thing as if it's the totality, we may be missing out on way much more nuance and way much more information. So I want us to start to think about the ways in which when we are experiencing something, we may be interpreting, making meaning of what is happening. And it is in that meaning that we are then responding. And the more space we can create to understand what meaning we may be making, or certainly to talk about the meaning of what we may be making, the more space there could be for something different. So there's a total difference between person A says something to us. We interpret it as they're angry at us. Now we're feeling ourselves getting defensive. They have no right to be angry at us. We're the ones that have a right to be angry at them. Like they're the ones that didn't do the dishes. I should be the one that's angry. How dare you speak to me this way? We're now getting defensive, right? And we're having this because we've interpreted something that person A has said to mean that they are angry at us. And now we're getting defensive and getting angry right back. What if person A wasn't angry at us? And now we're making this whole defense. We're doing this whole thing to protect ourselves from that person's anger. We're getting all upset and frustrated, and we pick this big fight because of this meaning that we're making of this person's comment. Imagine the difference if we were to be able to say in the moment, I'm interpreting what you just said to mean that you're angry with me. Now, what we're doing there is we're naming our interpretation. And in order to name our interpretation, we first have to be aware that we're making an interpretation. That right there is a difficult skill to develop. So we have to do a lot of work, right, to get to the place where we're maybe getting aware that we're interpreting. And in order for us to even get to that step, we have to acknowledge that maybe there is a way in which we're seeing the world that is based on our subjective experience and not what's really happening. We can get, though, so sensitive to feeling gaslit or to feeling disoriented when we have been told, no, what you're experiencing isn't right, but we're picking up on something and it is right. Right? We may get so sensitive there that we may have a really hard time with this idea. But it's important for us to get the support to think about this because it's not that our subjective experience doesn't have value and that it's not real to you. It's just that maybe it's not the only thing that's real and that another person may be having their own subjective experience. And maybe when instead of getting defensive and getting angry right back at somebody because we're experiencing their tone as anger, if we can name, hey, I'm interpreting what you just said to mean that you're angry with me. Now we're creating more space for the other person to say, yeah, I think you're right. I think you're accurately picking up on the fact that I am angry. Or for them to say, that's interesting that you think that I'm angry because I'm not angry. So let's make sense of that. That's not to say then that you're not still accurately picking up on something. It's just to say that maybe you are and maybe you're not. And in that space, there is opportunity. So there's actually a tremendous amount of freedom that comes when we can start to observe the interpretation that we're making rather than just assuming that what we're seeing is what's really happening. Another way of saying this, right, is that while we may not control the events or circumstances that happens around us, we encounter all sorts of things in our lives that we have very little control over. We do have the capacity to shape how we respond to it. And in this space, we can often, invite in pause, reflection, and exploration of alternatives so that rather than reacting impulsively, which closes down the possibilities or automatically based on ingrained patterns or fears or defenses, we can actually create, in ideal, more space for self-awareness, for emotional regulation, and for transformation to occur. So from a psychoanalytic perspective, what we're talking about here is creating a way in which we're stepping out of unconscious patterns and habitual defenses, right? And responding in a way that maybe aligns more with our deeper values, our desires, and self-understanding. So the invitation here is to start to install ways in our life for more slowing down, for more reflection, to build more self-awareness, for expanding, tolerating uncomfortable emotions. We may often really, really struggle with this because we want to collapse the space because there's something that's really unbearable that's getting evoked. So for example, if we feel like our person A is coming at us with a lot of anger, we may get defensive and say, you don't have a right to be angry with me. I'm angry with you because we're having a really hard time tolerating the possibility that person A is angry. And so we want to just get defensive, push back. We want to, make space or collapse the space so we don't have to tolerate potentially the other person's anger, which is in a way our own anger that we're having a hard time tolerating. Sometimes I wonder if our fear of conflict is not that we're afraid of the other person's feelings of aggression, but we're really afraid of our own feelings of anger and aggression. And so this all kind of ties back into point number one, right? Knowing more about ourselves helps us break our patterns. We know ourselves by creating space for insight and exploration. And so somebody may be asking, okay, so how do I do this? How do I create more space between stimuli and response, action and reaction? And the key here is to create space even after the fact. So this whole thing happened. The reaction was very quickly. Can you create some space within yourself, like having a weekly therapy sessions or weekly time with your journal to reflect on what happened and get more clear on what may be going on? When we can carve space for reflection, no matter how long after the event takes place, we're slowly cultivating and working up the muscle to be able to do it in the moment. So asking ourselves to do something different in a moment when we're feeling panicky, we're feeling unsafe, we're feeling scared is a big ask. This often happens. I often talk about this with my patients who struggle with an eating disorder, like binge eating, where the compulsion, the need to eat is so overwhelming that there's no stopping it. Once we get it in our minds that we need to eat, that we want to eat something, it's very hard to stop it, even though there's a part of us that doesn't want to be doing that thing. In those moments, it's really fraught with a lot of emotions. And so I tend to find myself saying, like, when you're caught up in a wave, see if you can just surrender to the wave with as much compassion for yourself as possible. When you're caught up in a fight and you're saying things you don't mean, see if you can kind of just imagine yourself getting caught in a wave. Like you're learning how to surf, you're caught in a wave, you're blah, 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 the waves are da. It's really painful, it sucks. You wish that you could be surfing on the wave. Instead, you're like getting knocked down, right? It's really painful, but you're just going to ride it out. You're just going to kind of surrender to the wave There's not much you can do in the moment, but then when you're no longer in the wave, maybe it takes some time to try to understand what was going on for me. Where did I not maybe stand on my surfboard correctly, or where may I have misjudged the wave, or what may have been going on for me in that moment that propelled me towards saying that or reacting in that way. And the more that we can reflect, right, and learn from what is going on, we're slowly working on building the capacity to be able to do it in the moment so that you catch more waves, so to speak, or can create pause in the middle of a conflict or in the middle of an escalated moment to say, hold on, I'm interpreting this way. Is this accurate? What's going on here? Yes? Okay. So point number 3 here of important concepts for a better life. What we don't address, we repeat. And this goes back to the unconscious. I know, everything goes back to the unconscious. It's a really remarkable thing, the ways in which this sense of our mind has so much power. But what we don't address, we repeat. This is another one of Freud's kind of seminal concepts. And it's amazing that I'm quoting Freud so much because psychoanalysis has evolved so much from Freud. I know that oftentimes we think of psychoanalytic psychotherapy or psychoanalysis as intertwined with Freud. And while he was, in a way, the originator, father, the one who birthed a lot of these ideas, the field has gone so far from him. However, for some reason, I'm feeling called to talk about this concept of his because it's very accurate, and we see it in a lot of the trauma work that we do in the field, where it's incredible how what we don't face, what we don't address, what we don't tends to get repeated over and over in our lives, almost in some ways as a way of trying to repair. It's like something gets caught in this cycle, and we keep really hoping that maybe if I play it over again, I'll be able to repair it. If I can do it again, if I can get myself in another similar circumstance to what it was like as a child, then maybe this time I'll be able to do it differently. So Freud observed that unresolved emotional conflicts, particularly those stemming from early experiences, often resurface in our lives in repetitive ways. And these repetitions can manifest in behaviors, in relational dynamics, and emotional patterns, and they're often driven unconsciously by what he called the repetition compulsion. And so the repetition compulsion is a way that he tried to describe this unconscious tendency to reenact past traumatic or unresolved experiences, even when those experiences are painful and harmful. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, right? Like, why would repeat something that hurts us? And Freud suggested, and we have now seen over 100 years later, how accurate this is, that these repetitions serve as attempts to try to master the unresolved conflict or the emotional pain. So in essence, the psyche is trying to bring into consciousness something for resolution. I really like this idea that Carl Jung is known for, that like there is something that is driving us towards healing. He deeply believed that there are all sorts of ways in which we are trying to heal. We are trying to make whole. We are trying to repair. Our soul is working so hard to move us towards our best life. And so it's a similar idea that the psyche is trying to bring the issue into consciousness for resolution, but without awareness, without consciously bringing more attention to what's going on, we often repeat it instead of resolving it. So we're getting caught up in the cycle over and over again rather than resolving. But the fact that we're getting caught up in something over and over and over again is the minute we can notice that, now there's opportunity for us to bring some insight, some awareness. And when we can bring some awareness, we start to change the patterns. So some examples, right, of this can look like a person who experienced emotional neglect in childhood. They may now unconsciously seek out patterns who are emotionally unavailable. Right? This is like a on-the-nose one. We talk about it as like having daddy issues or having mommy issues, right? Like we're trying to get our partner to love us in the way that our daddy didn't. And we're finding ourselves being in a relationship with our daddies, with our partner who mimics a lot of behaviors like our fathers. Or, for example, if we're talking about the worthiness wound, right? Someone who grew up with a worthiness wound or feeling deeply unworthy, they may now sabotage opportunities for success. Unknowingly sabotaging. They're not aware that they're sabotaging, but they are finding themselves sabotaging the very thing that they want. And so then they're unknowingly perpetuating their inadequacy. They're playing the worthiness wound out like a fiddle. So Freud believed, we still believe, this is still true to this day, that if we can bring awareness into this pattern, into breaking the cycle, if bringing awareness breaks the cycle, by the more that we can understand what's going on, how is these repeating, like what are we hoping, what is the fantasy, what is going on here? If we can start to bring some awareness to it, things start to change. Yes? So, what we don't address, we repeat. And that self-awareness is really important part of emotional processing. And emotional processing is a really important part of self-awareness. It's not just, I know myself. I don't know how to get help because I just know myself so well. It's that self-awareness has to aid in emotional processing, or it just becomes an intellectual endeavor. Yeah. Now, to be clear, patterns don't repeat because we're doomed or because we're broken. They repeat because something remains unresolved. And when we start to bring some awareness to what is trying to get resolved, we start to disrupt the cycle and create something new. Okay, so that's, I think, a really important concept for a better life. There's often this way in the manifesting world that talks about bringing attention, like what we bring attention to tends to grow. So don't bring attention to negativity because it will grow it. It will be more alive. And I've never seen something more inaccurate in my entire life. This idea is so problematic on so many levels. But I think at the core of it, there's something really sweet, right? At the core of it, what I think this idea that the manifestation world is trying to address is that where we tend to go in our minds is perpetuating something painful for ourselves. If we're finding ourselves in negative loop cycles, we're probably going to continue to experience a lot of pain. So the core of this, I think, is a way in which the world of manifestation is attempting to name and address this idea that what we don't address, we repeat, that something painful keeps happening. And if we're just continually going into these like negative thought patterns, it's probably connected to then negative behavioral self-defeating patterns. And so the theory goes, if you can address the thoughts, if you can have positive thoughts, if you can kind of control the thoughts that you have, then you are breaking the cycle of the negative patterns, right? And negative behaviors. So I think we're trying to say the same thing. The problem, of course, with the way in which I think the manifestation world is attempting to name this and address this is that what they're inherently saying, what it often gets translated to for us is don't have certain thoughts. Don't have certain thoughts because then bad things will happen. And if you bring awareness to the bad things inside ourselves, we're giving it more power. It's going to become more alive. We're going to create bad things. And there's like an omnipotent kind of fantasy in that like our thoughts have so much power to control our lives and our wish to be able to control more of our lives to make sure that nothing bad ever happens. That's how often I see people get internalize manifestation. It becomes a way that we're trying to police our minds. And that then isn't the point. That it doesn't work that way. Policing our minds actually will only create more strife and will only put more into our unconscious, right? We're driving more stuff into our unconscious by trying to block out certain thoughts. That's not how we break patterns. We break patterns by bringing more attention and awareness and curiosity into why we're thinking a certain way, why we're moving towards that. And if you're finding yourself getting stuck in these quote unquote negative loop patterns, and that the only way you know how to get out of that is by saying don't have those thoughts, you're probably playing out a kind of pattern of relating. I'm fantasizing that you were probably related to in a similar fashion, and now you're doing it to yourself. you were probably a parent, caregiver told you don't have certain thoughts, don't think that way. And now you're continuing to live that experience on it. It's very painful. And you don't have to kind of suffer alone in that. Okay, so that's the third concept. I can't believe we're almost at an hour here. I'm going to try to wrap up the final 2 ideas. So the next one is that change requires discomfort. And I read this really beautiful Instagram post, and I forget who said it, so I'm so sorry I won't be able to credit the original creator. But they said something like, sometimes it will hurt more to heal than the initial pain. That like healing sometimes will hurt more than the initial pain. And that can be really confusing, because then we're like, wait, how much of this is that I'm recreating the same painful dynamics, right? And how much of this is actually healing? And that's why it can be really hard to know alone. It can be really hard to do this alone. But it is painful. Healing is pain. It's going to require discomfort. It's going to require us to confront certain parts of ourselves. And this is, again, going back to concept number 1. There are very good reasons why we try to defend ourselves against our unconscious. There are so many good reasons. And now bringing more awareness, more of ourselves into our minds, of course, that's going to be uncomfortable. If we want to break relational dynamics that are self-defeating and are very painful, we may experience the difference as there being something wrong, because we're moving into something different. And we may feel like this is going against what I know, and therefore it is wrong. And it can then feel so disorienting. How do we know what's actually wrong? For example, having the emotional bravery to say to your partner, I'm angry with you, when we have been told our entire lives that we can't say that to somebody, and we do it, and then our partner gets angry back at us or whatever, right? Like responds in a way that's not super affirming. We may feel like that's wrong and we just did something wrong. And this is exactly why we don't do that in the first place. And so I want us to be really tender to ourselves, that oftentimes taking emotional risks feels really vulnerable, and we can very quickly want to push away the vulnerability by finding evidence to support why there's something wrong. But when we are in the process of healing, we are in the process of unearthing, we're in the process of opening ourselves up to more of ourselves, it may really feel like there is something wrong. But it's sometimes just a part of the process. It's just the messy middle of reorienting and reorganizing. A kind of metaphor that just came to mind is like if we're reorganizing our kitchen and we move our cups to a different cupboard, it may feel really wrong for the first few weeks as we're getting used to the cups being in a new cupboard, and we go to the old one and we're like, well, no, they're not there. And it can feel really wrong, right? There can be something feel very off-putting and very disorienting about where the cups are now. But maybe the cups are now in a better place ultimately, right? They're like closer to the dishwasher. It's like a better location for them. But it can still feel disorienting and wrong. But we know we can keep in mind that in the long term, this is ultimately better for us. And sometimes that can be so affirming to remember that in the long term, it's better to have more emotionally vulnerable conversations in our relationships. It's ultimately better for the relationship, even if it doesn't feel good right now. Taking the risk to be more open is always better, not necessarily because the relationship will be better, but because you will be better for it. And when you are better for it, all relationships become better. That may not mean that this particular relationship will become better. Maybe this relationship won't survive you being more emotionally honest. But ultimately, you are serving yourself because you are developing the capacity to tolerate these things in the types of relationships that maybe in the future you'll find yourself in that is just ultimately better for you. Yes? So sometimes it's going to hurt. And it's really a part of it. So back to Freud. He has this concept of working through, which refers to this kind of therapeutic process of repeatedly confronting and processing these unconscious conflicts, defenses, and emotional patterns until they can be understood and integrated and transformed. And so it's a really core tenet of this way of this kind of philosophy of thinking, which is that when we have experienced something really painful or we have a lot of conflicting aspects of ourselves, we're going to have to revisit it over and over and over again. And another way of thinking about healing is that sometimes it's like an upward spiral, right? We're going to revisit the same point over and over and over again, but from different perspectives, different experiences. We can relate to it differently because we're having these different emotional experiences as we're touching that painful thing. But we're going to have to touch that painful thing over and over and over again. I know, I really understand this fantasy that we're going to do it. We're going to do EMDR. We're going to address the trauma. We're going to move on. And then boom, bada, bim, bam, bam, right? Like everything's going to be good. We're going to do that work. We're going to go to that retreat. We're going to do this thing. And then we will be cured and we will move on and everything will be great. But that's just not how the mind works, particularly things that are relationally based or developmentally based. There are some things that are as simple as addressing it once and be done. But when it comes to these chronic ways of relating, especially something like the worthiness wound, it can be really, it sets us up to fail to believe that we just have to do it one and done. And the better way of orienting ourselves to healing work or the work of relating to ourselves is to remember that things have to be addressed over and over and over again for real change to take place, for something really permanent to get steeped in us. It requires us confronting and reorganizing and recalibrating and facing things several times. And, a key aspect of working through is that insight is not enough. Like insight alone, intellectual understanding of the problem is not alone to create the change that we want. Because when we're talking about working through, we have to get connected to the emotional experience. We have to get connected to the unconscious and deeper processes that is keeping us stuck in these painful loops. Final concept. Another important understanding for a better life is the importance of transference. Now, transference is this phenomenon where we are projecting feelings, thoughts, and patterns from past relationships into the present, particularly those in authority or those close to us. Now, transference is, again, it's an unconscious process. It's a redirection, so to speak, of emotions and experiences from one person, often a caregiver or a significant other from the past, onto a current person, someone that is in our lives right now. This can often happen in therapy, but it happens in everyday relationships, like partners, friends, colleagues, even strangers. Bosses are so ripe for transference feelings. We can feel, a great opportunity to know ourselves more is understanding more deeply our relationship to authority, religion, government, and parental figures, and how we relate to the authority of those institutions can all give us a really good indicator of how we may be relating to authority now. And these projections, right, cause us to react based on past experiences rather than present realities, which we talked about. And so then we are kind of, as we've talked about also, recreating the past in the present, all with the hopes that somehow we're going to catch it and we're going to notice it. But it often does lead to misunderstandings, to conflicts, and to really distorted perceptions. And so an example, right, is that like a person may feel really resentful towards their boss, even though their boss has not done anything to warrant such strong emotions. But we tend to find justifications for how we feel. So we may have found little things that our boss has done and like blown it up in our minds. Like, but they did this and they did that. And like now we're just feeling so much resentment towards our boss. And then through deeper exploration, they may begin to uncover that the resentment stems from unresolved feelings towards an overbearing parent and has really very little to do with the boss. But because it's so unaddressed, they are now relating to the boss as a parent. And it can get very confusing and it can get very overwhelming. And the past can become so alive in the present. And so, often when we think of something like psychoanalytic psychotherapy or therapy in general, a big thing that people say about therapy is that it's based on the past and then coaching is based on the future. Well, I don't think that that's true at all. I think therapy is based on the present in efforts to change the future. And we change the future by really orienting ourselves into understanding how the past is actually being very much alive in the present. I love the fantasy that these things can be separate, that like coaching can just focus on the future, but we miss out on a whole lot of ourselves if we're thinking about it that way. Because the truth is the past is always here. We can't just cut the past out. We can't just say, well, let bygones be bygones. The past is in the past. The past is always alive in the present and will impact our future unless we bring more awareness and attention to it. And so as this person is understanding more about themselves, they may start to see how they have been transferring those past feelings about their parent to their boss and relating to their boss as their parent. And then when we can create more space to see how that transference is happening, we can start to relate to the present with a lot more space. Like, wow, maybe this person is actually very different from my parent. And of course, this comes up all the time in our relationships. So much of our relationships and our conflict in our relationships can't really be resolved because they're a way in which the past is appearing in the relationship. And that is why so many intimate partnerships can be so fraught and so hard to navigate. Because we are not just relating to our partners, we're relating to their past, or we're relating to their parents. We're relating to their emotional life that has nothing to do with us. And then it pokes and prods at all of our emotions that have nothing to do with them. And so understanding transference, understanding how there may be more space for us to understand something of what's happening in the present than what is happening, right? There can be more space. There can be misinterpretation. That transference is happening to all of us all of the time. We maybe can start to create different dynamics within us. So those are 5 important concepts for a better life. As you may notice, they were also all psychoanalytic concepts because psychoanalysis and this philosophy of thinking has been so instrumental to me and has been such a profound way that I have found a greater understanding of myself. And it's such a rich way of working with people, of creating something so much different than they've ever thought possible. Because what psychoanalysis is really about is getting to the core of things. And instead of just putting Band-Aids, instead of just trying to fix behaviors, trying to get to the root, to the core, can create so much more opportunity for something different. Deeply believe that if you are to take these concepts as your own and try to find meaning in them, in yourself, you will find so much more betterness for yourself. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I love hearing from you. I'm on Instagram at I am Thaís Sky, and I will see you next time.